Good afternoon, Inspector. The session is now live.
Good afternoon. The inquiry's resumed, and unfortunately I left it at a rather awkward point, but it was 1 o'clock, but it wasn't deliberate that I left it. It was the time when Mr. Jones was explaining his evidence and going on to the guidance for buffer zones and protection of ancient and veteran trees. So I'm happy to resume at that point. I noticed that we are taking longer anyway over the tree session than we would, and that's not just because of me getting disconnected, unfortunately, but hopefully we can carry on with this and see how we get on. But it's to do with field maple T381. Just to go through that one with Mr. Jones, I think, if he's available. Anything that anyone wants to say before I move on to that? No, in that case, Mr. Jones, sorry about that again. This is amazingly bad with the connections that we're getting at the moment. So, but it was only a brief connection failure, but it was enough to mean that, because I didn't know how long it would take, so it was enough to think it was worth adjourning. But anyway, if you can continue, Mr. Jones, again, if you can remember where you got up to.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I will. I think I had taken you to the January 2022 guidance on ancient trees and veteran trees at core document 5.8b. And I had pointed out that there is a heading in there that says buffer zone recommendations. And I was explaining, and forgive, I'm not quite sure what time you disappeared, but I was explaining.
Well, it was about 1 o'clock, it was. So
yes.
It was about the right time for when we were going to adjourn, but yes, unfortunately it was rather not a very opportune moment. But anyway, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's fine. And I was explaining that a recommendation is not the same as a code of practice or an obligation. And with an obligation or a code of practice, the verb that usually goes with those is must. If you're obligated to do something, you must do it. If you're recommended to do something, you should do it. So what does that mean? It means you should do it unless you have evidence to show that perhaps it wouldn't be a good idea in this instance. And I think that's key to what we're looking at here. But because by relying on the guidance, the standing advice on ancient trees, I think the idea or the shape and the size of the buffer zone is not going to fit with the size and shape of where the roots are. The guidance goes on to say in the bottom of the second paragraph there that the buffer zone will create a minimum root protection area. Now, a root protection area is a phrase that first came into being in the British Standard 5837, which is one of the core documents at 5.7. And you will see at 5 in that core document at paragraph 4.6. Just remind myself as I open it. 4.6.2 that this recommends that modifications to the shape of an RPA should reflect a soundly based arboricultural assessment of likely root distribution. Now, Mr. Cook points out that standing advice doesn't reflect root that buffer zones can be or should be morphed in shape, but also it doesn't say that they shouldn't. It doesn't count that out. And as it makes it clear it's a root protection area, it is my view that if there is evidence to support the fact that the root system is asymmetrical or polygamous in shape, then it does not make sense to apply a circular root protection area nor a circular buffer zone, because as we now know, the standing advice is that buffer zones are minimum root protection areas. Now, in this case, as you will see in my proof, which is back to 7.10, core document 7.10, rather than go blind into this with just an assessment of where the likely roots would be of this tree 381, we have undertaken some investigations to confirm where they actually are. And these took the form of trial pits and ground radar, and they both backed up what was our original assessment, that the tree would be likely to be growing much more in the bank adjacent to the ditch, that is along the hedgerow to the north and south of it, than to the east and west. Originally, I had made a guesstimation, I suppose, when I first looked at this, that probably there would be less roots east and west because the land had been ploughed, but we now know it hasn't been ploughed. And the reasons that there are less trees to the east and west are because there is, simply because it hasn't been ploughed probably, there's hardly any organic matter in that soil. Secondly, it's been shown to be nutrient deficient. That's in the soil report, which is CD 1.7. And it's shown to be acidic. And as I pointed out in my proof of evidence, field maple is not a species that likes acidic soil. It much prefers neutral soil in terms of pH, and there's much more neutral soil on the bank where the soil is continually enriched by the falling leaves that grow on it. So the overriding point, I think, sir, here is that since Homo sapiens has evolved, we have used formulae to help us make sense of the world, to help us to understand things, to help us avoid having to start from scratch every time we decide on the importance of something or the lack of importance of it. But those formulae are there to help us compare, understand what we're experiencing, to help us qualify and quantify what we're experiencing, and to save us time. They do not tell us the outcomes of actions. They can only predict those, and sometimes not that well. Their function is to provide us with an experience-based framework on which we can decide outcomes. We must not rely on formulae to make those outcomes for us. Indeed, that's the substance of comedy, often, if it goes too far. Even tragedy if it goes further, but hopefully that doesn't apply to truth. So I think this is the key point on this tree, 381. We have demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that it's got very little root density under the fields and under the footprint of where the proposed sports pitches to be. It's around about 2.5 roots per square metre. Root density in the bank, the ground radar report, which perhaps I should have referred to more specifically, sir, which is appended to my proof of evidence called document 710, and at appendix number 6 of that. That has shown us the big difference in rooting density between the bank and the field underneath the footprint of the pitch. There's so few roots beneath the footprint of the pitch that with a density like that, I would consider it unlikely that if you were to build an underground car park on the footprint of the pitch, it would actually lead to the deterioration of that tree. But of course, we're doing far less than that. We're only taking off 50 mil of the turf, and that can be done in a sympathetic way. That could be ensured by condition. We are building up the soil above that. It's around by 400 millimetres, actually, not 500 as Mr. Cook had estimated. And whilst that is not put it this way, originally we were thinking that we would have to dig deeper to put that pitch in. There was a certain pitch thickness that has to be achieved, and I think Mr. O'Grady will talk to you about that later in the inquiry. But we thought it would be even less harmful, in fact, not harmful at all, to put most of the pitch above existing soil level rather than to dig it in. But actually, frankly, either way would work, and I don't see the tree would deteriorate as a result. And that's the bottom line, obviously, because as it says in the guidance, the standing advice on ancient trees and veteran trees, you should, it says here under making decisions, you should make decisions in line with paragraph 180C of the NPPF. And that means the simple question before you, sir, is will this lead to deterioration or loss of the tree? I think we've both agreed it's unlikely to lead to the loss of the tree. Will it lead to the deterioration? All the evidence that we've put before you, sir, in my proof of evidence, backed up by references to the soil reports, the pitch report, and to the historic landscape report, all tell me no, it will not cause any deterioration. Just to take that on a step further, there is the question of not just deterioration possibly being caused by the construction or the installation of the pitch, but also would deterioration be caused by the impact and of the use and maintenance of the sports pitch? In my view, sir, I see no evidence to support that. I don't think it would. At the moment, there's evidence to show that the top 200 millimetres of soil in the field is quite compacted, and there's very little root growth there. That is reported in the ground radar report at appendix 6 of the core document 7.10. So there's an opportunity there to actually decompact that before the new pitch is put on top. Once the pitch is put on top, that is going to be looked after, and so that will not become compacted in the same way, and the maintenance recommendations from TGMS appended to Mr. O'Grady's report makes it clear that it's going to be spiked regularly, which will allow for water and oxygen to pass through that. And that may even allow roots of the tree, such as there are, beneath the pitch to grow up into that and to take advantage of that soil. So that may lead to an encouragement of root growth. But I think the point that Mr. Cook was getting at, forgive me, Mr. Cook, if you weren't, and this is more to do with the maintenance of the pitch. Well, yes, the pitch is going to be regularly maintained. As we know, spiked regularly, mown regularly. But is the compaction that might be caused by that any worse than the compaction that might be caused by a tractor that might roll past this tree at any time now as it takes feed out to the sheep or whatever it does? In my view, not. It will be further away, and it's not likely to be such a large, heavy machine. Will the footfall be likely to be any worse in terms of causing compaction than the footfall that there is now? I think it will be better, because at the moment, a lot of the compaction would appear to be being caused by sheep. And sheep, having much smaller feet than us, even though they're lighter than us, they put a greater weight, pounds per inch or pounds per millimetre on the soil than human feet do. And it's not as if this is going to be a footpath that is going to be in 24-hour, or put it this way, 7 days a week use. So my view, sir, is that the impact in use, the impact of the use and maintenance of the sports pitch will not lead to any deterioration of the tree, because it won't represent a significant intensification of use. The final point that I just bring up that Mr. Cook spoke about, he said that there are roots extending out beyond 9 metres of this tree. He's quite correct. The ground radar report makes that clear. But they are at such light density, 2.5 per square metre, that I don't think that really makes any difference. 2.5 roots per square metre means that even if that whole area under the sports pitch was dug up, you're probably only likely to cut, by doing that, around about 180 roots, if you do the maths. And if you were to prune that tree, let's say you were to reduce it in size, it's a very densely branched tree. The number of cuts you would put in that would be probably 5 to 10 times greater. And I don't think anybody would really object to the tree being pruned in terms of, would it harm the tree? Would it lead to the deterioration of the tree? That's obviously subject to the specification. So that's our view, sir, that there is no evidence to show that deterioration will occur as a result of either construction or use of the pitch. Indeed, the evidence that we've supplied shows that there will not be any deterioration of the tree. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Can I just confirm the distance of the proposed sports pitch from the trunk of the tree? What's that distance?
The surround of the sports pitch, so is at 5.95 metres. So roughly 6 metres, because the centre of the tree is not easy to determine.
Yeah. Yeah. So that area, that first 6 metres isn't affected of it. So if you count that as a buffer zone, that's not really affected by the sports pitch. Is that right?
That's right. Certainly not by the construction of it. What we can't be sure of is whether, if people are spectating, and I'm not sure who's going to play here, but I'm sure it's not going to be a large professional football style crowd. I can't be sure that there won't be footfall within that 6 meters, but there is footfall now, mainly by sheep.
Oh yeah. No, I'm
Yes.
just trying to work it out as to, so really I mean, obviously the it's recommended 15 times the tree's diameter, which comes to what was the amount again? I can't.
Well, what we based, we based this on the diameter of the bole, which is what remains of the ancient tree, because most of the above ground part is stuff which has grown since the war. A section of it, the bole, is what's ancient about the tree, and some of that on the drain side, the ditch side, that's the east side, is above ground. So we measured it because of that, and the diameter came out at 9.72 meters for the root protection area.
Sorry, 9.72 meters
Radius.
For the root protection area.
That's correct, yes.
That's based on 15 times the tree diameter.
Sorry, 12 times the tree's diameter.
12.
Yes, the root protection area is 12 times the diameter.
But this is the buffer.
The buffer zone,
should be at least
15 times
larger
That's
than
right.
the diameter.
Yes. So root protection area 12 times, buffer zone 15 times. Root protection area was 9.72, and the I'll just tell you what the buffer was. Just not laying my hand on the calculation here.
Well, I can probably do it anyway.
Yes, absolutely.
That's going to be about 13 meters or something, isn't it?
It's 12 point something meters. Yes, I'll let you know that as soon as I've got it up on screen, which might be fairly soon.
So that's based on the root diameter. I mean the tree diameter that you calculated. So really, if we're looking, so that it's about half. It's about further 6 or 7 meters into that buffer zone, then, really, isn't it? The pitch is going on to, yeah.
But that would only be if you don't adapt to the buffer zone to fit where the roots are. And I see no sense in putting a circular root protection area or a circular buffer zone on an asymmetrical disposition of roots. The whole idea is to prevent the deterioration of the tree. We want to minimize the amount of damage to the roots. And so we need to avoid any disturbance where those roots are. And that's exactly what we're doing, sir, because the ground radar has shown us that there's very few roots indeed.
Oh, no, I know what you've said.
Yes,
I'm just looking at what I mean, I know you're saying these are recommendations, but this is what it says in the recommendations, isn't it?
That's right.
15 times the tree's diameter for the buffer zone. And then it says that where possible, a buffer zone should, and then it does all those things, and a buffer zone should consist of those. But obviously it won't be consisting of this buffer zone, will it? So
well, it's not going to consist, sir, of any buildings. It's not going to consist of any hard surfacing. It is going to
But it's not going to consist of semi-natural habitats, is it?
That's not for me to answer, really. I think it's more an ecological issue. I mean, all I can say is it's going to be grass. It's not going to be hard surfacing. So water and oxygen will still be able to penetrate through the grass to those roots that are under there.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that some of this is trying to maintain the habitat, but I think the habitat is also for the health of the tree, isn't it, as well, really? Yeah.
That's the main habitat. So that's what it's an ancient
yeah.
tree.
Okay then.
Yes.
So anyway, I've got that information from you, and you've certainly gone into a lot of detail, as I can see, to establish root protection zone. What I'd like to do, I mean, there's Mr. Cook, but there's also Mr. Coombs has raised his hand. But I'll do is I'll go on to Mr. Coombs first, because I think he raised his hand first, and then go on to Mr. Cook, who I'm sure seems to want to say something. But Mr. Coombs, you haven't had much to say yet, so I'll let you say something first, and then Mr. Cook can take it on board if necessary. Yes, Mr.
Thank you very much, sir. I think I wanted to make one or two points. I think, but you've just made one particular point I wanted to make yourself, which was drawing attention to what the buffer zone should comprise of, and in standing advice, and I think this was the point you've been making, that a buffer zone around an ancient or veteran tree should be at least 15 times larger than the diameter of the tree. And the standing advice goes on to say, where possible, a buffer zone should contribute to wider ecological networks and be part of the green infrastructure of the area. And as you said yourself, sir, should consist of semi-natural habitats. We might draw attention to the fact that a football pitch is not usually considered to be a semi-natural habitat, and that the components of the grassland in a football pitch would consist of improved grassland, and there would also be considerable nutrients and management applied to this zone, i.e. the buffer zone, which could have an impact upon the tree's health. And taking the point about the soil conditions and the soil chemistry, but it would also, I feel, be relevant to point out that this tree, having been there for a considerable amount of time, its roots and also the fungi associated with the roots will have considerable time to have adapted to the soil chemistry that's there at the time. So potentially impacting the soil and the chemistry, and definitely changing the management, could lead to a direct impact upon the health of this tree. Also point out in terms of the tree's ancient and veteran tree status, Mr. Jones quite rightly referred to coppicing. Now, coppicing is the process of repeatedly cutting a tree over a number of times. And we have practiced coppicing in our country since Neolithic times. And it is possible that in continuing to cut a tree, you prolong the life of the tree, you potentially increase the diameter of what you may describe as the stall of the tree. And this means that it is extremely difficult to quantify exactly how large an ancient coppice stall may be. And as it prolongs life, it may increase the life of a species such as a field maple. Reference has been made to maps and photographs. And if you look at the first edition Ordnance Survey map of the site, you would see there is a field boundary in that position. Field boundaries, it may well be that field boundaries had a hedge on top of them, and in a hedgerow situation, a tree could be coppiced as often as every 7 years. So it is not always possible to point to maps and indeed historic photographs, which we know weren't taken for the purposes of identifying the presence or absence of trees. It may well be that this was a hedgerow tree or a shrub, if you will, and therefore would not necessarily show up as a fully developed crown of a tree. So it is possible that this tree is of considerable age.
Mr. Coombs, I'm really sorry to stop you. I think we've lost the inspector again.
Okay, thank you.
I don't
Oh
think.
no, okay, sorry.
You know,
Okay, you're not showing on my screen. All right,
I'm
okay, no
looking at-
problem. Sorry.
and just to that leads on to a point where comparison was made with this being a field maple with an ancient oak, which would obviously be a far more considerable tree. When we consider ancient trees, we must do so, and we are guided to do this species by species. So we must assess a veteran tree in terms of normal trees or young trees or mature trees of that type, and we must not compare it to other species, for example, oaks. And I think that's all I want to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coombs. And Mr. Cook, I'll hand on to Mr. Cook. That you wish to say something.
Yes, sir. Thank you to Mr. Coombs, who's probably saved me quite a few words in his adept analysis there. I wanted to say, in terms of the condition of the ancient tree, that it's referred to as cut down or collapse, that it's not just the above ground part that's important, and that the standing advice makes no distinction between the above ground part or the below ground part. And in one of the, in Lonsdale's document, which is CD 5.9, in 5.4.5.4, he devotes a whole section to the management of lapse coppice, including the recognition that decay is likely within a stall. And in terms of my knowledge of field maples, I think the tree runs out, I think Mr. Jones said it was 0.81 meters in diameter. It would take a long time for a stall of 0.81 meters to grow. And I think Mr. Coombs' analysis of it may well have been there for much before that and managed as a coppice and regularly cut down is probably very near to the mark. I also agree with Mr. Coombs in terms of taking things on a species by species basis, and that this field maple is not worth any less than a large oak. It's seen the same in terms of policy and the standing advice. In terms of the root morphology, I think I would like to refer to my rebuttal, where I made a rather coarse but reasonably indicative drawing 1, below paragraph 17, where it shows the morphed buffer zone and it shows all of the root protection areas around. Now, if we take into account all of those root protection areas around where nothing would occur, and we look at the extent of the buffer zone that would be afforded within what Mr. Jones describes as the best part of the habitat, and where along the hedge line where perhaps the organic matter's better, I fully appreciate that. It would already be protected and a semi-natural habitat. And in my view, a root protection area, as I've made clear, I feel should be centered, and it should, wherever possible, be at least 15 times the diameter, circular, because the aim of this is to provide a buffer. It's to provide as much space around that tree so that it doesn't have to change, so it doesn't have to adapt. And clearly, despite the nutrient poor soil, the compaction, this tree is living there quite happily. And the buffer zone should protect that tree. My final point is that I've had a good look around through materials I can find, and I'm sure Mr. Jones has too, and I'm sure you will, sir, but I can find no appeal judgment that relates to a council or someone else coming against an appellant in an appeal situation where a judgment has been made that the buffer zone can be overridden or change shape. And I think that may be a very interesting point to carry forward.
Yeah. Can I just ask though, although you're saying that the buffer zone shouldn't be overridden, but this buffer zone is a buffer zone that's there to protect the tree. But what I think Mr. Jones is saying, that the work that's going on in that buffer zone is potentially going to improve the prospects of that tree by aerating the soil and even so what harm even the use of that isn't necessarily any worse than what use the ground has or potentially has at the moment for grazing sheep and even ploughing the field. It's potentially could be ploughed, that field, couldn't it? There could be tractors using it. So that the actual proposal for use of that what if you count it as a buffer zone, why is that harmful to that tree? Or why would it be? I mean, is it harmful for a start? I mean,
change can cause difficulties for trees. It's obviously in a low nutrient environment, and maybe high nutrient could cause the tree to grow much faster. I don't know. That is a difficult question, but I think that the standing advice again is very clear, and Mr. Coombs picked up on this, that a buffer zone should be a semi-natural habitat, and really affording something that is a semi-natural habitat around this tree and ensuring that there is absolutely the minimum of disturbance is the thing that's likely to cause it to live the longest, in my view.
Yeah, but you're not saying that what's proposed would necessarily. Well, are you saying that what's proposed will be likely to kill that tree off?
I think to kill the tree, unlikely, but it is going to cause change to the tree. And I see that under both MPPF 180 and the standing advice to be a deterioration, because that tree has a natural habitat around it, a semi-natural habitat, if you like, the agriculture, and that it seems to have found its stasis. It's still there after a considerable number of years, and to change that could well be a deterioration. And in terms of the buffer, buffer is designed.
When you say there could well be, I mean, what are you basing that on?
In terms of the deterioration, that
yes,
there could well be more compaction along the edge with people spectating. I think that the use of it would not be very low intensity. The tractors running over it. I do think the intensification could well be a deterioration and not be in the tree's interests. It's very difficult to quantify what may happen. And I guess, should this appeal succeed, in 40, 30 years' time, one would find out, and perhaps the long-term tracking of these sorts of things would help inform arboriculture.
But can you say, you've said more on the use of the land rather than what's going to be done to create that football pitch?
Well, we have an overburden of soil, and it's generally recognised you shouldn't change soil levels within root protection areas. Only very small changes. I think that, yes, it is difficult to qualify exactly what harm will occur.
Right. Thank you. And I know. So is there anything else you'd like to say before Mr. Coombs is asked to put his hand up, so I'll move over to him if you're...
No, thank you, sir. All done.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to Mr. Coombs, and then Mr. Jones has got his hand up, but I'll ask Mr. Coombs what he'd like to add, and then...
I don't know if it's useful to you, sir, but just to clarify a point regarding the possibility of this land being ploughed. It is, of course, currently agricultural land, permanent grassland, so it is protected at the moment under the EIA regulations. And so if current land use was to continue, we would anticipate that the current soil conditions and protection of the tree that extends to the tree would be kept in place. I hope that's a useful point to you.
Right, so what you're saying is that the tree is protected as such, and so they shouldn't be able to plough near it.
My understanding of permanent grassland, sir, is that you cannot plough permanent grassland, which my understanding is that this is without an environmental impact assessment. So we would anticipate that in its current usage, that land would not be ploughed, or at least if it was, it would have to go through an appropriate assessment, which would identify that tree as being an ancient and veteran tree. And therefore, we would hope it would extend protection to that tree by maintaining its existing environment.
Right. Okay, thank you. But maybe Mr. Jones can say something on that one as well, unless he doesn't know anything about it. But anyway, Mr. Jones, I'll hand over to you on the points you want to make. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. On that point, I don't have the reference to hand, but I'm fairly sure I read that in the council's evidence, and this may have been the council's landscape or the heritage evidence. Somebody will inform you of this, no doubt, later during the inquiry, that there is a covenant on the land dating from around 1820 that forbid the ploughing of it. So right. My understanding was that that could be the case. I'm not saying it is, but it could be.
Yeah,
I can certainly see from the trial pits we dug, it hasn't been ploughed for a long, long time.
Yeah. So that's unlikely that it will be ploughed if it was left as it is.
I'd say so.
But you might still get, what you're saying is you might get tractors running along it or something.
Well, I think you could get tractors along there. Perhaps it could be drained. I don't know. Maybe that needs an EIA as well. So, yes, there's already agricultural activity there, and that will continue, I presume, if the site continues.
Right, that's clarified that anyway. Okay. That it's not likely to be.
Two points I'd like to make, if I may, just further on what we said. It's interesting that Mr. Cook is not really coming up with any substantial reasons why this proposal is going to be harmful to the tree or is going to lead to the deterioration of the tree. And perhaps that's why he is so reliant on the government guidance and the standing advice. I too have not seen an appeal where a buffer has been built into or an inspector has allowed a buffer to be built into. But then this isn't a building, this is just replacing grass with grass and a slight overburden. But also the date of the updated standing advice, 14th of January, means that possibly the changes that have been made have not yet gone through the system. We may be one of the first inquiries where they have. And those changes are those points that I made to you before, sir. It says in there, you should make decisions in line with paragraph 180C of the NPPF. It states quite clearly that the buffer zones are recommendations, not requirements. And it states quite clearly that the buffer zone will create a minimum root protection area. And root protection areas, as I said before, are you are recommended by the British standard to change those in shape if there is reason to support it. And we believe there are reasons to support it. My very last point, sir, is that now this doesn't appear in my evidence, so I hope you'll bear with me if I just point this out to you, and it might be something worth looking at the site visit, is that when you enter the site from Appledore Road, the western of the two fields there, it has been used, but not for around about the last 10 years, I understand, as a sports pitch. It became a sports pitch, I understand, in the 1930s. That is next to a row of oak trees that runs up the eastern boundary of that site, of that field. And that actually includes one veteran oak there, tree 197. And that can be seen on the tree protection plan or the avenue protection plan that we provided. Possibly best seen on the tree protection plan, which went with our original report. So that would be core document 1.13, appendix 4. There's two plans there. If you look at the east one, and look just north of the horse chestnut number 43, which we discussed before lunch.
Yeah.
We'll see a row of oaks that runs up there between trees at fields F13 and F40. One of which is a veteran. Of course, the sports pitch used to be in field F13. It's not used anymore, but it was a sports pitch. And all of those trees, which are oak, much larger in terms of height and spread than the tree we're talking about, 381, the field maple, they all seem healthy and have adapted very well to the location of that sports pitch.
Right. Okay.
I have a final point, if I may. Sorry.
Right.
I said that was my last, but I forgot the other one. The final point is that Mr. Cook says that the proposal would cause change to the tree. He didn't really specify what change that was. But can I point out one thing? The tree's not covered by a preservation order. And as Mr. Coombs said, in the old days, the tree was probably coppiced every 7 years. So what is to stop that tree getting coppiced at any time? And wouldn't that change be even greater than anything we're proposing? I believe it would. But the tree would be able to recover from that. Because that's the way it's lived, and that's the way, as I can't remember, forgive me, whether it was Mr. Coombs or Cook said, that it actually prolongs the life of trees by coppicing them and then recoppicing them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jones. Is there anything else anyone would like to say on concerns about this tree, the field maple? That hasn't been said. Like I say, I can go and have a look at it. I've got the evidence that I've been given, and so I've explored that really in quite a lot of detail, I think. So right then, I'll move on, because there's the off-site oak tree T313, which I think might, I mean, there's a potential that this one could be harmed, but I thought there were some changes that have been taken on board that might be able to help with that. So maybe I'll hand over to Mr. Jones again to highlight what this is about, and because this one's been highlighted anyway, and it's to do with drainage as far as I can see, and whether the drainage proposals will help to keep that tree. Really, I don't know whether we need to go into the importance of the tree as it's going to be preserved or hopefully protected in the scheme anyway. But so if you can highlight what your proposals are, if there are, and I think there's been some changes, haven't there, to help with that? Is that...
There have, sir. Yes, tree 313 is a mature English oak tree. It is situated outside the red line site boundary within the garden of Marm House. This is the house which you will remember is lived in by Mr. Poole's daughter and her husband.
Mr. Poole.
Mr. Poole, yeah. Who spoke yesterday. I think he's next door, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
It is a large and healthy tree. It is actually covered by a tree preservation order dating from 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the subject of a clause of reason for refusal number 4. But that reason for refusal has been withdrawn, as I understand.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's still concern about it, but just wanted to explore why that's the case.
The concern, sir, I think, was the proximity to that tree of the proposed attenuation swale, which was part of the surface water drainage features that were shown by RSK. And they came very close to the root protection area of that tree. RSK have confirmed that the surface water layout, which you see on the plan submitted, and you will see on that same plan you just looked at now, that I referred you to look for that line of trees. It's down on the south boundary. Oops, wrong plan. Right. And when I say south, southwest, and the proposed drainage swale or attenuation pond was very close, which obviously concerned Mr. Cook and the local planning authority when they saw that. So consequently, we spoke to RSK. They said that the drainage layout was illustrative only, and that the drainage feature could be moved away, well away from that tree. And that's exactly what is intended to be done. But as it's part of the, it would be part of a reserved matters application in the event that the appeal was allowed, then that could be dealt with then, either as part of the application or by condition. And I believe that that is what the local planning authority have agreed to.
Right. Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I've got Mr. Poole, who's probably concerned about this tree. If Mr. Poole can just explain? I know you're not part of the round robin, but as it's part of your own, the round table thing. So as it's part of your relative's property. So what have you got anything to say? If you can unmute yourself, Mr. Paul, and Mr. Paul, you're on mute at the moment.
How's that? Can you hear
Yes,
me
that's
now?
right.
Right.
So are you content with what's been said?
Well, I did want to make a comment, if that's okay. I did refer to it yesterday in my statement.
Yes.
And well, a couple of things about that. One is that although RSK, in terms of the swale, I understood that the attenuation basins were to collect water, which bearing in mind we're at the southern part of the site and the lowest part, one of the lowest parts of the site. And if you'd seen those photographs that was in my photo library, you may do, you will see where the water gathers. And I assume that swale was designed to collect that water, but the design of the swale originally went right through the root protection area of that tree. And whilst I understand that RSK have agreed to shorten it, it's the issue about being illustrative worries me, because if they find that that swale having been moved back doesn't work in the way that they think it will, and that the water still collects outside of our property, then there's a high, to me, I have a worry that we may get flooded. And so whilst I understand, and the issue is when they class it as illustrative, to me that sounds like it could be changed again in the future.
Sorry, Mr. Paul, sorry to interrupt you. I think what I'll do, can I leave this for the drainage expert when he comes forward about that? Because I don't think the tree experts are going to be able to explain how that works. I think what Mr. Jones has just said is that it's illustrative, and so it's been moved. I think that's got to go in. We've got to assume that it can be moved for these purposes, and then we'll look into that later on when it comes to the drainage. I think that's going to be better.
Yeah, if you
sorry about that, but I don't think that's really going to be the thing to discuss at the moment. Is there anything else you'd like to say on that tree?
There was one other point, and that in the proof of evidence that Mr. Jones put forward, he put in calculations about the root protection area, and I mentioned it yesterday about the offset. I mean, we can debate the offset, but I don't obviously take up your time with that at the moment. However, in the proofs of evidence, because the tree has grown, there was reference to, with the current diameter, that the root protection area would extend out to likely to be 13.56 meters. So in other words, it wasn't just about the swale. If you look at the drawing, which is part of that proofs of evidence, the actual root protection area shown on their diagram is exactly the same as it was when it was first presented, probably at 12 meters. Mm-hmm. And my concern is that although that diagram is, if the root protection area should be extended out, then it's not shown on that diagram, which is part of the evidence for this inquiry, and therefore it might be missed. And so I'm asking that it's looked at again with a view to what that root protection area should be for this tree.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Paul. Okay. I'll ask Mr. Jones about that, and I don't know whether he'd like to say anything about the swale as well, but I think that the drainage part, your concerns about drainage, I think we can look at under that particular witness who's going to come forward on that. But
I'm very happy to do that. Thank you for that.
Thank you. So, Mr. Jones, you've said something on this. and
Thank
and
you.
so
Thank you.
about
Steve.
this, I mean, really, it's more to do with how you can protect and make sure that tree is protected, really, because I'm assuming that you're going to make sure that that tree isn't harmed by the development. Isn't that the case? Yeah.
That is the case, sir. I appreciate Mr. Poole's concern, because it's clearly very wet around there, and I'm presuming that he, like all of us, would like to see an effective drainage system and a happy, healthy tree, if trees can be happy. If the if the appeal was allowed and a reserved matters application, which included a surface water drainage strategy, showed that the surface water drainage would have to come into the root protection area of that tree, that would have to pass under Mr. Cook's nose, because the council wouldn't approve a reserved matters application without checking on tree impacts. And I'm sure Mr. Cook would then be able to, or be very willing to, liaise with RSK or whoever the drainage engineers happen to be, to find a solution. So it's not going to happen just because we're not sure exactly whether it can happen right now. It will be looked at seriously if the appeal is allowed.
And this applies to the root protection area as well.
The root protection area, so yes, we estimated that root protection area because I think when we did the survey, there was no one in, and we had not made prior arrangements to go onto their property to measure that trunk. And so we resorted to estimating it. We have heard from the Limestone Protection Group that they think the trunk diameter is larger than we estimated it by 130 millimetres. In that case, the root protection area would be larger. It would be 13.5 metres, as I stated in paragraph 6.3.3 of my proof. So I think the first thing to do, if this ends up as a reserved matters application, is to arrange with Mr. Poole's daughter to go around and measure it properly, so that then we can get a proper indication of the extent of the root protection area, and we can then assess whether that needs changing in shape, because it may do, because of the proximity of Mr. Poole's daughter's house, and then we can come up with something which RSK or the drainage engineers will have to avoid.
Right, thank you. Right, Mr. Cook now has got his hand up. So, Mr. Cook.
I'll be very brief. I can confirm that this is on our radar, and should this be part of any RM, we would liaise in order that the tree data is accurate, which I'm sure Mr. Jones would do, and consider that and make sure that there weren't any incursions within the root protection area, and that all the levels would suggest that it would function as it should do.
Yeah, and likewise that the council has withdrawn this reason.
Yes, it has, because we feel that this can be dealt with through
Yeah.
conditions.
Right, thank you, Mr. Cook. What I'll do now then, I'll move on to the other trees that have been mentioned. So I think most of these trees were mentioned by Mr. Coombs, is it, in the consultancy role? Because I don't think these are ones that the council have actually flagged up. So these were ones that Mr. Jones has mentioned in his evidence, but I think Mr. Coombs might have referred to them. Is that right?
I believe so. I'm not sure exactly which trees they are. In my report that we were asked to do on behalf of Tenterden Town Council, identified 5 trees that met the dephrometric criteria of being either ancient trees or veteran trees. I think Mr. Jones has commented on my report in his proof.
Yeah.
From paragraph 7.2.1 on page 74 of his proof. I think we've covered all the matters really that are relevant in my report. Mr. Jones very kindly, he mentions that he has agreed with me on one tree, but not on the other. I just think it might be useful if Mr. Jones could clarify. I believe, looking at his drawings, that would be tree number 315, the English oak. I think I might be right in saying to Mr. Jones that that's the tree we are agreeing on.
I think Mr. Jones did agree that that was a veteran, but
Yes.
And that's been missed off the veteran. But I don't know whether it's actually going to be avoided by buildings or whether there needs to be changes to the buildings. Now it's been identified as a veteran.
I can
I
help
think
you.
Thank you, Mr. Coombs. If Mr. Jones can now go
Yeah.
through it, then that will help. Right, thank you.
Yes, I can help you on that, sir. I can confirm that in my view, 315 is a veteran. It was not called as such in our original report. I think for the reasons that our surveyors didn't think it was of sufficient size, and they thought that it was just suffering because the ditch that runs south of that pond, which the tree stand next to, is blocked. And consequently, the pond is much, much bigger than it used to be. And I think that has possibly accelerated the veteranization process. So their consideration was that it wasn't a veteran, it was just suffering from being waterlogged. But I looked at it and I thought, no, it is trying to retrench. And that, I think, is the key factor in whether a tree is a veteran or not, allied with size and various other considerations. On the point of whether the design and the layout of the buildings can avoid harm to the tree, yes, they can, because the layout is, again, illustrative at this stage. The illustrative layout at present, as you will see on the tree protection plan at Appendix 4 of my original report, CD 1.13, has 2 parking spaces reaching north. They would encroach into the veteran tree buffer of the English oak number 315 if that buffer is agreed to be circular by 1.25 metres. Of course, we may decide that the buffer is not circular. It may mean that they would encroach by even more. So again, at reserve matters stage, a tree constraints plan showing an agreed buffer needs to be put around that tree for the architects doing the detailed layout to design around. So I'm confident that tree can be retained.
Right. And then the other 2 trees which were mentioned, I don't know whether they're of any vital amount, but they've been mentioned, T302 and 303, which I think are part of the same tree, aren't they? That from what I gather.
There are 2 trees on the south boundary, sir.
All right.
They are also outside the site boundary. You can see them on the same tree protection plan I referred to you a moment ago. One of them well, both of them are English oaks. They both stand in gardens of properties. One looks like in the garden of number 5 Limes Close. That's tree 303. And tree 302 is in the garden of number 47 Appledore Road.
Right.
They're both mature oak trees. And Limestone Protection Group have raised the question as whether they might be damaged because the root protection areas appear to be too small. And just to the north of them on the illustrative layout, there is a footpath, a proposed footpath, and a proposed swale, as you'll see. Now, I've checked those trees out myself. Again, the trunk diameters were estimated by our surveyors, and the trunk diameters that Limestone came up with were considerably larger in the case of tree 302. So I've looked at that myself, and I have to put my hands up and say that one of our surveyors had, if not an off day, he had an off estimation moment when he estimated the trunk of 302. Limestone consider, I don't know whether they've measured it, and if so, where they measured it, it may have a diameter of 1.035 metres. My estimate that I took from outside the fence is 950 millimetres. So rather like tree 313, if the appeal is allowed and the reserve matters application is being prepared, it will be important to go and get accurate measurements for those trees. That would inevitably, I think, make the root protection area of 303 larger, and that will have an impact on certainly where the proposed footpath might be set out, and possibly where the proposed swale might be set out. But I see no reason why the root protection areas cannot be avoided, and why the avoidance of any deterioration cannot be achieved.
Right, thank you, Mr. Jones. So, I mean, I've gone through those last few points a bit quickly, but I think they're just ones that needed to be touched on because they've been raised. But I just wanted to make sure that they were had been looked at. Are there any other matters that anyone wants to raise regarding trees? Otherwise, I'll be finishing this round table session on trees, but then there'll be other evidence on landscape and how these trees might be involved in that as well, maybe on the cross-examination, which is the next topic to be dealt with, is landscape. So in that case, what I thought the best thing to do is to adjourn now for 15 minutes, and we'll be looking at the council's witness to be called, Mr. Howell Williams. Is that okay? If you can call your witness after the break.
Yes, I will.
Sorry, Mr. Jones. Before that, Mr. Jones has got his hand up.
I'm sorry, sir. I just wanted to wind up this section with just one overarching comment, if I may, because I think it's relevant. The arboricultural features of this site are largely one of trees and hedgerows in a hedgerow pattern, which was established clearly after enclosure in the early 17th century. there's no woodlands on the site, but it is a very clear pattern of trees and hedgerows. And by and large, it's worth making the point that that pattern is going to be retained. And that considering the amount of trees that are within the site, the fact that only 2 mature trees are going to be removed, which are those to allow the access, I think is a very positive arboricultural outcome, and one which might not necessarily have been the case if we hadn't worked so hard at it. So I just think it's worth putting all we've said about the trees we've discussed today into that overarching context. That by and large, the pattern and the composition of the site, arboriculturally at least, will be retained.
Right, thank you, Mr. Jones. Well, we'll be looking at how it affects the landscape and other matters very shortly. Thank you. So what I'll do then, I'll adjourn until 3:30, and then if Mr. Hal Williams can call his witness, which is Mr. Withicombe, and give the evidence in chief, Mr. Withicombe, and we'll see. I think that's as far as we're probably going to get today, but I'm not sure. Well, I don't know the exact timings for the rest of it, but we'll see how we get on. But anyway, so